Let me ask you a question. Did you even know that there was a country called Burundi before clicking on this video? I'm sure very few of you would be able to locate it on a map. However, Burundi has the dubious honor of leading a ranking. It is the poorest country in the world. It is poor even by African standards. With a per capita income of just $274, they are poor even by African standards. To give you an idea, Liberia, which is not exactly Luxembourg, triples their per capita income. And the prospects for the future are even worse. So why are we talking about Burundi today? Well, because right next to Burundi is another country, Rwanda. Rwanda and Burundi are two first cousins. Both countries were Belgian colonies. In fact, they were the same colony. You could even say that once they were the same country. Today, both countries are dictatorships. However, the situation in Rwanda is very different. Of course, Rwanda is still a poor country. Just look at these two photos. On the right, you can see Bujumbura, the formal capital of Burundi. And as you can see, it's a pretty desolate landscape. On the right, you have Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. It is still an impoverished city, but you can already see modern skyscrapers, hotels, and some infrastructure. But we're not only talking about photos. When we crunch the numbers, the realities of both countries is increasingly different. Take a look at this graph. As you can see, both countries were equally poor in the 1960s, but Rwanda is growing like crazy, while Burundi seems to be stuck in misery. And the question is, why is Burundi still the poorest country in the world? Why is its neighbor Rwanda growing so much more rapidly? What are they doing differently? Today, we're going to answer all these questions, but first, let's look at some history.
The Forgotten War.
What if I told you that ethnic races could be created from a government office? That is, a bureaucrat can create racial divisions where a relatively homogeneous society once existed. Sounds dystopian, doesn't it? Well, this is what the Belgian settlers did when they called the Rwanda-Urundi territory. Many historians claim that this area of Africa was one of the most ethnically homogeneous, but the Belgian colonists decided to create an artificial division. Hutus on one side and Tutsis on the other. Suddenly, all colonized people had to carry an identity card showing which group they belonged to. The Tutsis, who were the minority, were given the best jobs. The Hutus, who were in the majority, were given the worst jobs. Gradually, ethnic tensions began. In 1962, Rwanda-Urundi gained independence from Belgium and became the two states we know today, Rwanda on the one hand and Burundi on the other. In theory, this sounds like good news, doesn't it? Two countries gaining their freedom. From then on, the fairy tale will begin, wouldn't it? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The Tutsis were left with the Burundi government. This led to protests by the Hutus. In response, the government killed between 100,000 and 200,000 Hutus. In Rwanda, it was the other way around. In this case, it was the Hutus who staged a coup d'etat in 1973. Since then, thousands of Tutsis have been massacred or driven out of the country. However, the real genocide came in the 1990s. And what was the precise event that unleashed the massacre? Well, pay attention to this news story.
The presidents of Rwanda and Burundi die when the plane in which they were traveling was attacked.
On the 6th of April 1994, the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi were on a plane. As they were about to land in the Rwandan capital, Kigali, a missile shot down the aircraft. And that is how the two countries entered into two separate civil wars. In Rwanda, the Hutu-run government radio began broadcasting messages like this one. In only 100 days, the Hutus massacred 11% of their population. You heard correctly. The Rwandan genocide is one of the most savage episodes in modern history. We're not just talking about an army killing people, it was even the civilians themselves, armed with machetes, who took to the streets to kill their neighbors in the most savage ways you can imagine. This is what happened in Rwanda. In Burundi, they had been enduring civil war for decades. In the 1970s, the Tutsis had exterminated hundreds of thousands of Hutu. In the 1990s, the tables were turned. In other words, both countries experienced a race war with very similar characteristics. However, now comes the big difference. In Rwanda, the Tutsi refugees who managed to escape the country organized themselves in refugee camps. And this is where this man you see on screen, Paul Kagame, comes in. Kagame defeated the genocides and became president of Rwanda in 2000. He is still president today. Rwanda is far from being a democracy, but we'll talk about that later. In the case of Burundi, it's very different. In this case, the civil war did not end until 2003. In Burundi, the protagonist of this story is the other man you see on the screen, Pierre Nkurunziza, president of Burundi from 2005 to 2020. And how have these two countries evolved since then? Well, let's take a look at that right now.
A country without motorcycles.
Let's be clear. Geography is not on Burundi's side. First of all, the country has no natural resources. It is also landlocked, so there are no ports to export anything. However, in the year 2000, good news came for the country.
The Arusha Agreement, signed in 2000, offered new democratic promise, inclusive institutional arrangements, and greater accountability of political elites. The Burundi peace process was therefore widely celebrated by outside observers.
This agreement opened the way for multi-party elections. Unlike Rwanda, Burundi seemed to welcome democracy with open arms. And it was in 2005 that our protagonist, Pierre Nkurunziza, came to the scene. This man belonged to the Hutu ethnic group, but wanted to put aside racial identities. He came to power with this message.
The blood spilled in the last 12 years is plenty, and plenty enough.
As we have seen on VisualPolitik, what politicians say is one thing, and what they actually do is another matter completely. Since 2005, Burundi has been a long way away from being a democracy. To give you an idea, it's one of those countries where international observers have to go with what is called a minder. That is to say, a person from the government who is in charge of being something like their shadow. So no observer can see anything that the government does not want them to be seen. In any case, Burundi does not even make an effort anymore to show signs of being a democracy. Take a look at this news story from 2015.
Burundi's president, Nkurunziza, wins controversial third term.
The president announced that he would stay in power in spite of the constitutional limits. He had himself proclaimed Eternal Supreme Guide. That's right, I repeat, Eternal Supreme Guide. As you can imagine, after this self-appointment, protests were not long in coming. And as you can imagine, the Eternal Supreme Guide repressed them with all of his might. More than 400,000 refugees had to leave the country. To this figure must be added the thousands of executed persons and those that simply disappeared. The UN Human Rights Office is even closed down. In fact, Burundi was the first country in the world to leave the International Criminal Court. Why? Well, because they wanted to investigate alleged crimes committed between 2015 and 2017. However, of all the repressive measures they have put in place in the country, the most striking is the ban on motorcycles. That's right, riding a motorcycle is one of the most serious crimes you can commit in Burundi. And why, you might ask? Because they say that people on motorcycles might be conspiring. But the icing on the cake of the Eternal Supreme Guide was this news item.
Officials jailed after Burundi leader roughed up at soccer game.
That's right, Nkurunziza was playing soccer in a team, of which he also happened to be. Try to look surprised, okay? He also was the owner. And he decided to send two people to jail during a soccer game because they fouled him. The truth is that not even the script writers of VisualPolitik come up with plots to match the real life stories about this president. In the end, and to the surprise of many, he announced in 2019 that he would not seek re-election, and his chosen successor, Evariste Ndayishimiye, who is the current president, ran instead. Nkurunziza died shortly after following a heart attack, and new elections were held, but it seems that things have not changed. Pay attention to this.
Burundi holds elections marked by violence and the coronavirus.
In other words, we are not only talking about a savage dictatorship, we are also talking about a totally arbitrary and ultra-violent dictatorship. And you may ask, what kind of economy could develop in such a country? Well, pay attention to this graph. Here you can see Burundi's exports as a percentage of its GDP. As you can see, not only are they much lower than the average for all of sub-Saharan Africa, but in addition, the trend is downwards. As you can imagine, a country without resources like Burundi, what does it need? Foreign investment. That is, people willing to build factories of some kind. The problem? Who would invest in a country like Burundi? To begin with, they have three essential impediments: border bureaucracy, no legal security, and corruption. For example, there are checkpoints everywhere, and at all of them they ask for a bite. This means that if you are landlocked, sending any goods to the nearest port costs a fortune. In addition, Burundi is the most densely populated country in Africa, and the population growth is enormous. Add to this weak economic growth, and the result is a continuous increase in the poverty rate. It is expected to reach 87%, considering a threshold of $1.90 per day. Its GDP per capita is the lowest in the world. To give an idea of its poor development, it is estimated that only 12% of the roads are paved. But wait a moment, because from the West, they are trying to throw all kinds of help to try to get this country out of poverty. How? Well, with measures like this one.
Burundi welcomes EU decision to lift sanctions against the country.
After 6 years, the European Union and the United States have turned a blind eye to Burundi's dictatorship and lifted economic sanctions. The question is, will this change anything? It'll be difficult for Burundi to ever export anything to the United States or the European Union when they have nothing to export. And I know what many of you are thinking. Burundi is a doomed country. It is impossible for a country in that area and with a history marked by genocide to escape poverty, isn't it? Well, pay attention, because now we're going to show you the other side of the coin. We're heading to Rwanda.
African Singapore.
While Burundi has banned motorcycles, Rwanda is the first country in the region to develop its own model of motorcycle. Of course, don't expect a state-of-the-art racing motorcycle, but at least they have reached a sufficient level of development to be able to create motorcycles. Think of the whole value chain it takes to manufacture something as complex as a motorcycle. We are talking about lots of suppliers, workshops, and skilled labor. Rwanda has come to have all of that. In other words, without having great natural resources, they have been able to develop industrial products. But what they have done so well in Rwanda that has not been done in Burundi? Well, let's take a look at their recent history. As we were saying a few moments ago, Rwanda came out of the genocide with Paul Kagame. Of course, Paul Kagame does not aspire to be a democratic president. He's been in power for 22 years, and it does not look like he's going to leave anytime soon. However, his model of governance is a very clear reference to Singapore. If we talk about human rights, he will most likely fail. But if we talk about economics, we realize that he kind of knows what he's doing. Their way to avoid future genocides is to eliminate freedom of speech so that there is no racism. After what we saw with the Rwandan radio, we can see that in this country, they understand what hate speech really means. In Rwanda, as in Singapore, it is strictly forbidden to make the slightest racist comment. Not even allusions to Hutus or Tutsis can be made. Of course, the Kagame government is as repressive as any dictatorship. However, it is much less arbitrary. In a study conducted by Transparency International out of 180 countries, Rwanda ranks 51st, while Burundi ranks 165th. Yet another reason to understand the disaster. For example, is there political repression in Rwanda? Of course there is, but it is no different from what we can find in the rest of the continent. Here, at least, the government has managed to guarantee security. Today, Kigali is considered one of the safest cities in all of sub-Saharan Africa. It is difficult to find reliable statistics, but there is one thing that does not lie: tourism. Take a look at this graph. For example, there are already international hotel chains that have opened huge complexes in Kigali, from Marriott to Radisson. But we are not only talking about tourism, they have also come to develop trade and financial services. According to the Doing Business ranking, Rwanda is the most favorable country in Africa for doing business, and is ranked above Spain and Japan. In fact, it is said that setting up a business can take less than 24 hours, and it ranks second in the world for countries with the best property registration protection, and the third in terms of access to credit. They even have factories, breweries with huge companies such as the Burwala Company, technology companies, and many more. There are suspicions that the statistics provided by Rwanda are not entirely accurate. In fact, the last 2 years, foreign investment has plummeted. But one thing is certain: Kigali today is a completely different city from what we saw in the news in the 1990s, and the macroeconomic figures show a major difference. Let's take another look at this graph. As you can see, Burundi has almost 4 times less GDP than Rwanda, which practically the same population and a shared history. Both took 2 different paths, and the difference could not be more palpable. In other words, there is one very clear conclusion we can draw from this comparison: politics matters. Regardless of history or natural resources, it is the political institutions that make the difference between this and this. But now, the questions are over to you. Is it possible to make the development of a country like Rwanda compatible with democracy? What lessons can Burundi learn from the Rwandan case? To what extent can Rwanda get out of poverty? Will we see it in this decade? Or maybe Kagame will go crazy and sabotage all the development of his country? You can leave me your answer in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to our channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you next time.